Between Two Worlds. Episode 2, What the Night Keeps. Some things do not announce themselves. They simply arrive the way dawn arrives, without knocking, without apology, already inside the room before you know to close the door. The morning did not come gently to Busan. It came the way it always came to port cities built on commerce and salt, and the long memory of hard weather, abruptly, indifferently, with the gray-blue muscularity of a tide that owed no one a soft entrance. The harbor caught the first light in pieces, distributing it across the water in flat silver shards, and the cranes along the dockyard stood against the pale sky like enormous iron sentinels that had never once been moved by anything as inconsequential as beauty. The city woke to the sound of itself, horns, the percussive clang of a container being lowered, the low diesel groan of a truck finding its gear on the incline of the coastal road. Busan did not pause to consider the night it had just lived through. Busan never did. But Marcus Kwan Campbell, who had been lying awake in his narrow apartment on the hill above Nampodong since somewhere around 4 in the morning, understood the city's indifference perfectly and found it no comfort whatsoever. He had not slept. He had performed the architecture of sleep, the closed eyes, the still body, the deliberate and conscientious breathing of a man attempting to convince himself that he was finished with the day. None of it had worked. The woman from the market moved through the dark behind his eyelids with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew she had every right to be there. Not her face, exactly, though her face was precisely and infuriatingly clear in his memory, the carved composure of her features, the way one strand of dark hair had escaped whatever order she had imposed on it and rested against the side of her neck like a small, deliberate act of rebellion. It was more the quality of her stillness that refused to leave him. The way she had looked at him as if she were simultaneously calculating the cost of looking and unwilling to stop. He had met women who were beautiful. He had met women who were guarded. He had never before met a woman who performed both at once and made the combination feel like a language he did not yet speak but recognized, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, as one he had always been meant to learn. Her name was Ji-yeon. He had that much. He had that, and the ghost of a scent he could not name with any confidence, something clean and faintly floral, something that had nothing to do with the fish and diesel perfume of the night market, and everything to do with the kind of deliberate, careful woman who would choose it. He had the way she had paused before walking away, as if the decision to leave had required more of her than she expected. He had turned that pause over in his mind for hours now, examining it from every angle the way he examined a structural drawing for the load-bearing truth of it, and he could not arrive at any reading of it that did not leave him wanting to find her again. He rose before 5. He made coffee in the small kitchen that overlooked the rooftops of the hill, the steam rising from the mug in the cold morning air that came through the window he always left cracked open, because he had grown up with his mother's insistence that a room without moving air was a room that had given up on itself. He drank the coffee standing up. He looked at the architectural drafts pinned to the board above his table, a partial elevation study, a cross-section of a proposed residential structure he had been assigned in class. The clean mathematical language of load and span and material tolerance that he genuinely loved and that gave him, most mornings, a sense of the world as a place of problems that could be solved if you were patient and precise enough. This morning the drawings looked back at him with a blankness he could not fill. He showered. He dressed. He told himself he was going to the waterfront early because it was a good morning to walk. He told himself the air would clear his head. He told himself a great many things as he pulled on his jacket and went down the hill toward the harbor, watching from just above and behind the particular angle of his self-deception, did not believe a single one of them. The night market was a skeleton of itself in the morning. The stalls were collapsed or sheeted, the fairy lights extinguished. The whole vivid geography of the previous evening reduced to a cluster of folded frames and stacked crates, and the particular melancholy of a festive space that has been returned to ordinary materials. A few vendors were already moving through the space, setting up for the day, their voices low and economical in the early air. A cat, orange, deliberate, moving with the sovereign assurance of an animal that belongs to no one and therefore to everywhere, picked its way between two stalls and disappeared. Marcus stood at the edge of the market area and looked at the place where the near collision had happened and understood, with a clarity he would have preferred to avoid, that he had come here looking for her. He stood there long enough for the cold off the water to find the gap at his collar. He stood there long enough for the cat to reappear from a different direction and regard him with a flat amber appraisal before moving on. She was not here. Of course she was not here. There was no reason she would be here, and Marcus Campbell, who was a practical man, a man who had learned practicality the way all children of complicated lives learn it, as a survival skill before it becomes a personality trait, acknowledged this, turned and walked toward the docks. He was clumsy that morning in ways that had nothing to do with his hands. Marcus was good with his hands. He had always been good with his hands. His hands were the first thing that had marked him as different from the other children on his Busan street, and then, paradoxically, the first thing that had made him belong, the hands that could fix the stuck hinge on old Mrs. Beck's gate, that could recalibrate the tension on a cargo line by feel alone, that moved over a drafting table with an ease that his instructor had once described as almost architectural in itself, as if the design already existed and Marcus was merely revealing it. But that morning his hands were somebody else's. He missed a grip on a strap and caught it badly, and the whole load shifted, and he spent 30 seconds fighting a problem that should not have existed. He miscalculated a clearance by enough that the man working the adjacent station turned to look at him. He knocked a clipboard from its hook with his elbow and watched it clatter to the concrete floor and stood there for a moment longer than was necessary before picking it up. Deoksu saw all of it. Deoksu saw everything. He had been seeing everything at these docks for 31 years, and in 31 years at the Busan waterfront you developed a quality of attention that most people would have called wisdom, and that Deoksu himself, if pressed, would have called nothing at all. Because he had no patience for naming what was simply the accumulated cost of paying attention. He was 63. He was built like a man who had decided, sometime in his late 40s, to stop arguing with gravity and simply become denser. His face was the particular face of a man who has been outside in all weathers for decades, not aged so much as condensed, every line the record of a specific conversation with the elements. He had watched Marcus Campbell grow from a 12-year-old following his uncle along the dock perimeter with enormous, processing eyes to the man he was now, and he had watched this with the careful, quiet satisfaction of a person who takes genuine pleasure in witnessing growth without needing to take credit for it. At the mid-morning break, Deoksu sat beside Marcus on the low concrete barrier at the dock's edge. The harbor moved below them with its perpetual, indifferent industry. Deoksu unwrapped his food and ate with the unhurried focus of a man who has learned that a meal break is one of the few times in a working day when the world cannot reasonably demand anything of you. Marcus ate nothing. He held his water bottle and looked at the water. Deoksu said, eventually, without looking at him, that the sea was restless today. Marcus said yes. Deoksu said that restless water and restless men had a way of finding each other. Marcus looked at him. Deoksu continued eating, his expression precisely as neutral as the sky. He said nothing further. He did not need to. The remark landed in the space between them with the gentle accuracy of a thing that has been aimed with great care and does not need to announce its arrival. Marcus looked back at the water. After a while, The corner of his mouth moved in a way that was almost a smile. Deok-soo finished his rice, folded his wrapping with the crisp economy of a man who wastes nothing, and stood. He placed one hand briefly on Marcus's shoulder, one hand, for seconds, the weight of 3 decades of accumulated affection compressed into a gesture that made no demand and asked for nothing in return, and walked back to his station. Marcus sat there a moment longer, feeling the warmth of the hand long after it was gone. Understanding that he had been seen and that being seen by Deok-soo was one of the few forms of witness in his life that required nothing of him except to continue becoming whatever he was in the process of becoming. Across the city, in a room that had been designed to feel like the inside of a thought, spare, cool, without ornament, the furniture chosen for its function and its silence, Ji-yeon Park sat across a table from Seo Jae-min and understood. With the particular acuity of a woman who has survived for 3 years in an environment where miscalculation is not an abstract concept, that she was being assessed. Seo Jae-min was 36. He was the kind of man whose attractiveness was inseparable from his precision, the way a well-made instrument is beautiful not in spite of its functionality, but because of it. He wore his suits with a proprietary ease, as if the fabric existed primarily to demonstrate that he was the kind of man who wore suits like that. His face was composed of elegant angles and an absolute absence of warmth. Not because warmth was foreign to him, Ji-yeon had seen him be charming, had watched him deploy it with the calibrated confidence of a man who knows exactly what he is doing. But because warmth, this morning, was not the instrument he had decided to use. He was the nephew of the Brotherhood's patriarch. He had grown up understanding power the way other children grow up understanding weather, as an ambient condition, something you learned to read and navigate before you were old enough to have words for it. In the 3 years Ji-yeon had worked for the Brotherhood as its primary language specialist, Seo Jae-min had treated her with a precise and unvarying professional courtesy that she had always understood to be its own kind of surveillance. He had noticed something the previous night. She knew this the way you know when a room has changed temperature, not from any single datum, but from the accumulated evidence of the air itself. He had not said so. He was not a man who announced his observations. He collected them, filed them, allowed them to inform his decisions in ways that surfaced later, in other contexts, when the subject had forgotten the original event. He had, instead, offered her the new assignment with the smooth impersonality of a man doing routine administration. The Japanese liaison meeting, he said. 3 days from now. The Wamak estate. His uncle's guests from Osaka would require interpretation across 2 sessions, and the matter was sensitive, as she would understand, and her particular discretion was one of the reasons she had been chosen. He said this without inflection. He might have been describing a change in weather. Ji-yeon thanked him. She accepted the folder he slid across the table. She met his eyes for the appropriate duration, not too long, which would be a challenge, not too briefly, which would be an admission, and held the stillness that she had built around herself over years of practice, like a room she could step into when the outer world required a performance of tranquility she did not feel. She did not feel tranquil. She had not felt tranquil since the previous night, and the reason for it was coiled in her chest with a specific, persistent weight of knowledge that cannot be unknown. What she had heard at the Brotherhood meeting, the words that had reached her because she had been positioned closer to the inner room than the leadership had realized, words exchanged in the fractional gap between one session ending and another beginning. A gap that the men in the room had assumed was private because it lasted only 40 seconds, and because Ji-yeon was a woman, and because women who work for men like these are very often not fully counted as presences in a room until they are needed. What she had heard was the name of a man. A lieutenant named Cho Byung-soo, who had been with the Brotherhood for 11 years, who had a wife and a daughter in the Saha district, who coached youth football on weekend mornings and drove a 10-year-old sedan, and who had, according to what she had not been meant to hear, been quietly supplying information to a law enforcement contact for the past 8 months. The Brotherhood knew. The Brotherhood had decided. The decision had been made with the same unhurried efficiency with which Seo Jae-min had just offered her this morning's new assignment, and it would be executed with similar impersonality, and Cho Byung-soo, who coached football on weekends, did not know that he had been found out. Ji-yeon knew. And she had no safe harbor for what knowing this meant, because there was no version of this knowledge that was survivable if she was seen to possess it, and no version of silence that felt like anything other than complicity. And she had been carrying this through the night and into the morning like something hidden under her coat, pressed against her ribs, colder with every hour. She took the folder home. She changed clothes. She moved through the hours of the afternoon with the outward composure of a woman who has many times before been required to function while her interior life conducted its own, entirely separate emergency. At 5:30, she took the bus to her parents' apartment in the Dongni district because it was Tuesday, and on Tuesdays her family ate together. And the architecture of her family's expectations was not a structure she had yet found a way to demolish without bringing the whole edifice down on everyone inside it. Her father's apartment smelled of soy broth and floor wax and the very specific atmosphere of a home in which the rules of propriety have been maintained for so long that they have ceased to feel like rules and have become instead the texture of the air itself. Park Sung-hyun was 61, and he filled a room with his voice the way other men fill rooms with their bodies, expansively, comprehensively, with an assumption of occupancy that left little space for anyone else to be fully at rest. He was not a cruel man. Ji-yeon had, over many years, been required to make this distinction carefully in her own mind, because cruelty and her father were not the same thing, and to conflate them would have been both imprecise and unfair. He was, instead, a man of deep convictions that he had inherited from his own father, and had never once been sufficiently inconvenienced by circumstances to seriously interrogate. He believed in bloodlines with the proprietary seriousness of someone who has confused inheritance with achievement. He believed that the women of his family had always understood their proper role, and he offered this observation periodically, and without apparent awareness that it was a claim and not a compliment, as evidence of the family's distinction. That evening he spoke about the Yoon family's daughter, who had married a man from outside the community, and how this had unsettled things. He spoke about cultural integrity as though it were a type of construction material subject to degradation under exposure to foreign elements. He spoke about his own marriage to Ji-yeon's mother, who sat across the table and ate her soup with the serene, practiced stillness of a woman who has resolved, somewhere in the middle of her life, to stop fighting weather, as a model of proper alignment. A thing correctly made. Ji-yeon ate. She agreed to nothing aloud. She refused nothing aloud. She had, over years, developed the skill of being present at her father's table in a way that fulfilled every external requirement of presence while maintaining, somewhere in the innermost room of herself, a separate and inviolable quiet that her father had never been able to reach, though he had occasionally, without knowing it, pressed his hands against its walls. Her mother met her eyes once across the table, briefly, and in that brief exchange passed something that had no name, but that Ji-yeon recognized as a form of love that had learned to live inside limitation and had not become less itself for the accommodation. She left at 8:30. She kissed her father's cheek. She embraced her mother for 4 seconds longer than was strictly required by the occasion, and her mother's hand pressed once, firmly, against her back in a language that needed no translation. On the bus back down toward the city center, Ji-yeon looked out the window at the lit-up arteries of Busan passing in the darkness and felt the architecture of her life pressing in from every direction at once, the Brotherhood and its cold geometry. Her father's apartment with its fossilized expectations, the knowledge coiled in her chest like wire, the face of the woman she had been required to perform all evening without once being permitted to simply be. The city moved outside the glass. She was 31 years old. She had 3 languages and one secret too many and a feeling she still had not found a name for, that had arrived the previous night at a waterfront market when a man with a Jamaican lilt in his Korean had caught her before she fell, and then, more dangerously, looked at her as though he actually saw her. She got off the bus one stop before she should have. She told herself it was the air. She told herself she needed to think. The waterfront was not in any rational sense on her way home, but she was already walking toward it before the deliberate, careful, professionally composed part of her mind had finished formulating its objections. Her heels were quiet on the pavement. The harbor smell reached her before the water came into view, brine and rust and the deep, cold exhalation of something very large and very old, the sea's perpetual reminder that everything built along its edge exists at the sea's pleasure and nowhere else. She walked out to the railing that lined the upper promenade and put her hands on the cold metal and looked at the water and tried to think about anything at all except the thing she was actually thinking about. And she managed this for approximately 90 seconds before she stopped trying. Marcus had stayed late at his drafting class. He had needed to, in the specific and productive way that a person sometimes needs a problem they can actually solve, a set of constraints that are knowable and a solution that exists within the limits of geometry and material science and the clean, unambiguous authority of structural logic. His instructor had noticed his focus that evening and remarked on it, and Marcus had nodded and returned to the elevation study and said nothing about the fact that the focus was partly displacement, that he was pouring himself into the drawing because the alternative was to spend another 3 hours in the particular restlessness of a man who cannot stop thinking about a woman whose last name he does not know and whose world he cannot read and who had walked away from him at a market the night before and taken something with her that he hadn't known he'd been carrying until it was gone. He left class at 9:15. He walked home along the water because he always walked home along the water, had done so for 12 years, since he was old enough to make the walk alone, since the harbor had become the place where his 2 selves, the Busan self and the other self, the Korean-speaking son of the city and the Jamaican-born child his mother had carried here at 6 years old with 2 suitcases and a ferocious, unassailable belief in the future, met and did not argue but simply coexisted in the sound of the sea. He carried his architectural drawings in a cardboard tube under his arm. The night was clear. The water took the city's light and did complicated, beautiful things with it that no drawing could fully capture, though Marcus had tried more than once in the margins of his notebooks, because he could not look at the harbor at night without wanting to find the line that would hold it. He saw her before she saw him. He stopped. Later, much later, in the way that significant moments are revisited long after the fact and examined for the thing that was true about them from the very beginning. He would not be able to say with any precision what he felt in that first second of recognition. It was not disbelief. It was not triumph. It was something quieter and more fundamental than either of those things, the feeling of a key turning in a lock that you had not known existed in yourself until the specific pressure of the specific key revealed it. She was standing at the railing with her hands resting on the metal and her face turned toward the water, and the city's light was behind her and the cold harbor air had put color in her cheekbones. And she was the most self-contained person he had ever seen, and also, he understood in that same moment, the person in this city who most needed someone to see through the self-containment to whatever was living underneath it. He crossed toward her slowly. He had learned from years of being a large man in spaces where largeness was sometimes read as threat, from years of being a black man in a Korean city where his presence still occasionally caused a recalibration of assumptions he had not asked anyone to make. To move with deliberation. To let his intentions be visible in the pace and direction of his body before he was close enough for anything to be misread. But there was something else in it tonight, something that had nothing to do with learned caution and everything to do with instinct, the instinct of a person who has found something rare and understands. In the animal part of himself that predates language and reason and social navigation, that the worst thing he could do to it is rush. She felt him before she turned. There are people whose presence changes the air around them, not through any mystical quality, but through the specific, physical phenomenon of attention, the way that genuine, focused attention from another person is something the body registers before the mind processes it, a warmth or weight at the periphery of sensation that some people spend their whole lives ignoring because they have learned that most attention is not safe. Ji-yeon had learned this particularly well. She turned, therefore, with the controlled speed of a woman who has trained herself not to react, and she saw him standing 6 feet away in the harbor light with his architectural drawings under his arm and his jacket open at the collar, and that look on his face. That particular, precise, devastating look of a man who has just found something he thought he had lost and has not yet decided what to do about the fact that he is relieved. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The water went on doing what water does. The city went on being itself behind them, indifferent and illuminated and enormous. The harbor air moved between them, carrying its ancient cargo of salt and cold and the residue of 1,000 working days, and in the middle of all of this mundane and massive world they stood in the specific gravity of a second meeting, which is always more charged than the first, because the first can be attributed to accident and the second cannot. The first can be called chance. The second is a choice, even when neither person has admitted to making it. Marcus said her name. Just her name. No preamble, no performance of casualness, just the 2 syllables of it offered into the space between them as a form of acknowledgement, the verbal equivalent of I see you, and I remember, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Ji-yeon felt the name in her own chest as though it had been handed back to her. She had given it to him the previous night as a small, controlled act of disclosure, the minimum required by the moment, and he had kept it. And he said it now with the kind of careful accuracy of a person who has been practicing the sound of something they wanted to get right. He did not close the remaining distance between them quickly. He moved to the railing 2 feet to her left and put one hand on the cold metal and looked at the water for a moment before looking at her, and this small, deliberate act of not overwhelming the space, of arriving beside her rather than in front of her, of giving her the water to look at while she decided what to do, this undid something in Ji-yeon that she had been keeping carefully fastened for a very long time. She was aware of his size beside her, the warm mass of him, the breadth of his shoulders in the dark jacket, and she was aware of her own awareness in a way that she rarely permitted herself. Aware of the fine-tuned animal sensitivity of her own body toward his, the way the warmth radiated from him across the 2 feet of cold air between them like a form of information she had not requested and could not stop receiving. He did not know her world. He had no idea what she carried tonight, what was coiled in her chest, what name she had heard in a room she had not been fully counted as occupying. What cold-eyed man had watched her face this morning for evidence of a crack in the composure she maintained as a professional obligation and a survival strategy and a cage she had built so well she sometimes forgot it was a cage. He did not know about the Brotherhood or Seo Jae-min or Cho Byung-soo or the estate on the outskirts of Busan, where she was expected in 3 days to translate the language of men whose business was conducted in the grammar of coercion. He did not know about her father's dining room and the specific suffocation of a table where you are beloved in theory and managed in practice. He knew her first name. He knew she had dark eyes and controlled movements, and the quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned the hard way that stillness is a form of armor. He knew that she had paused before walking away from him at a night market, and that the pause had cost her something, though he could not have said what. She could not afford his world either. She knew this. She knew it with the same cold clarity with which she knew everything that was dangerous, thoroughly, without sentimentality. With the part of her mind that had never once since the age of 24 allowed itself the luxury of ignoring a risk because the alternative was pleasant. A man at the waterfront who did not know what she was, who looked at her with that particular, ruinous quality of attention, who moved as though her comfort mattered more than his own momentum. This was not a safe thing. This was, in the taxonomy of risks she had been quietly maintaining for years, a category of its own. And yet, Busan glittered behind them both. The harbor offered its perpetual, cold witness. The cardboard tube of architectural drawings rested against the railing between them, and Ji-yeon became inexplicably aware of the fact that this man had been in a classroom somewhere in the city, bending over a drawing table, making the careful and patient marks of someone who looks at empty space and imagines what could be built there. She thought about what it meant to be a person who spent their evenings learning to design the structures that hold things up, and she thought about this in the context of a woman who had spent years maintaining a structure designed primarily to hold her together. And she did not examine why these two thoughts had arrived in the same moment. He did not ask her what she was doing here. He did not perform the surprise of the coincidence or invite her to perform it with him. He simply turned from the water after a while and looked at her with a steadiness that had nothing aggressive in it, a steadiness that was, instead, the visual equivalent of a door held open to extend it, and because he was the kind of man who had decided, somewhere in the formation of himself, that what he wanted mattered and that he was allowed to make it known without apology and without theater. The light from the city behind him caught the lines of his face, and Ji-yeon looked at those lines, and at the darkness of his skin against the harbor light, and at the patient, open quality of his eyes, and felt something move in her chest that was not the coiled wire of the secret, not the press of the walls of her life, but something entirely different. Something warm and directionless and frightening in the specific way that things you have not felt before are frightening because you have no map for them and no practiced response. She should have left. Every calibrated instinct she possessed, every carefully constructed protocol of her professional and personal survival, the entire edifice of the self she had built to navigate a world that had repeatedly demonstrated its willingness to be lethal when carelessly handled, all of it suggested, in the collective voice of years of hard-won wisdom, that she should thank him for the previous evenings near rescue, should offer some minimal pleasantry, should walk away. She was good at walking away. She had made it almost a discipline. The water moved in the harbor below. The city held its light. The cold air pressed against her, and the warmth of him pressed back from 2 feet away, and Ji-yeon Park, interpreter, keeper of secrets, daughter of a dining room she could not breathe in, employee of men she had begun to fear in a new and specific way, made a choice. Not a large choice, not yet. Not a declaration or a confession or a step toward anything she could see clearly. A small choice, the smallest possible choice, the kind that is so quiet that the person making it can, if necessary, claim afterward that they were simply standing still. She did not leave. She turned back to the water, and her shoulder was 2 feet from his shoulder, and she stayed. In a story full of forces, the Brotherhood's cold machinery, a family's suffocating love, the vast and indifferent harbor, the accumulated weight of 2 lives shaped by worlds that had not been built to hold each other, in all of this, a woman chose to remain in a specific place for reasons she could not yet articulate, next to a man who did not know her world, and the choosing of it, the small, quiet, stubborn act of staying, was the most dangerous thing she had done in a very long time. Not because of what he was, because of what she felt. And, because what she felt was hers, only hers. Arrived at by no one's design and subject to no one's management and alive in her chest alongside the secret and the fear and the weight of everything else like a light that someone had just switched on in a room that had been dark for longer than she had admitted. Busan breathed around them. The harbor kept its ancient, salt-dark watch. And neither of them moved, and neither of them spoke, and the night held what the night always holds, everything that cannot be said in daylight, everything that exists only in the space between one moment and the next, in the gravity of a choice made quietly. In the warmth of two people standing together at the edge of a dark and luminous sea. Episode 2 of Between Two Worlds,